Somewhere beneath the sun-baked earth of West Africa, there is gold that no living person has ever seen. Not a metaphor, not folklore dressed up for a documentary. Actual, physical gold, buried, hidden, and deliberately erased from every map that could lead back to it. And the man responsible for hiding it wasn't a pirate. He wasn't a warlord scrambling to protect a treasure hoard from invaders. He was, by most modern economic estimates, the richest human being who has ever lived. Richer than Rockefeller, richer than Bezos, richer, some historians argue, than every currently living billionaire combined. His name was Mansa Musa, and here's the strange part. Most people have never heard of him. Not because his story isn't remarkable, it's because it was too remarkable. Musa gave away so much gold on a single trip through Egypt that he accidentally collapsed the value of gold across the entire Mediterranean economy for over a decade. Merchants went bankrupt. Currency had to be restabilized. Historians still argue about how long it took the region to recover. But that's not even the story we're here to tell. That's just the surface. Because underneath Mansa Musa's mountain of gold was something even more valuable. A city so devoted to knowledge that it became one of the greatest intellectual centers on Earth, filled with hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, law, medicine, and mathematics, at a time when much of Europe couldn't reliably produce a book. That city was Timbuktu, and what happened to its knowledge, where it went, what was hidden, what was destroyed, and what still hasn't been found, is a mystery that scholars are still piecing together today. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how a single man briefly became richer than entire nations, why his empire's true wealth has never been fully calculated, and why, according to oral tradition passed down for 7 centuries, some of that gold was never spent, never traded, and never recovered. It was buried, on purpose, and the location was meant to disappear with the people who buried it. We'll get to exactly where that legend points later in this video. But first, you need to understand who Mansa Musa actually was, because before he became a legend, he was almost a footnote. To understand Mansa Musa, you have to understand Mali before Musa, because the empire didn't start with him, and it very easily might have ended before him too. The Mali Empire emerged in West Africa in the early 13th century, founded by a ruler named Sundiata Keita, whose life is remembered today through an oral epic recited by griots, West African oral historians and storytellers, that reads more like myth than history. Sundiata is said to have been a sickly child, unable to walk until age 7, mocked by rivals to his father's throne, exiled from his homeland, and yet somehow returned years later to defeat a tyrant king and unify a patchwork of small kingdoms into a single, sprawling empire. Whether every detail of that story is literal history or embellished legend, the empire it produced was undeniably real and undeniably massive. At its height, the Mali Empire stretched across a huge portion of West Africa, encompassing territory that today would include parts of modern Mali, Senegal, Guinea, Mauritania, Niger, and beyond. Estimates of its size vary, but some historians place the empire's territory at over 400,000 square miles, comparable to Western Europe, and running straight through the middle of that empire were 2 resources that made it almost unimaginably wealthy: gold and salt. Here's where it gets interesting, because the way Mali handled its gold trade is genuinely unlike almost anything else in medieval history, and it's the first real clue toward understanding the hidden gold mystery we'll circle back to later. The empire controlled access to some of the richest gold fields in the known world at the time, regions like Bambouk and Bure, where gold was mined in staggering quantities. But here's the twist. The Mali rulers never allowed foreign traders to see the actual mines, ever. Merchants from North Africa would travel for months across the Sahara to trade for Malian gold, but they were kept away from the source. Trade happened through a system historians call silent trading. Goods would be left at agreed locations, both parties would withdraw, and an exchange would happen without either side ever directly meeting or seeing where the gold actually came from. This wasn't paranoia, it was strategy. By controlling information about the gold's origin as tightly as they controlled the gold itself, Mali's rulers protected the single most valuable secret an empire could have, the location of a resource everyone else desperately wanted. That instinct, hide the source, control the myth, protect the gold with secrecy instead of just armies, is going to matter a lot later in this video, because it's the exact same instinct that some historians believe explains what happened to Mali's wealth generations later when the empire began to collapse. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before any of that collapse, Mali experienced its golden age, literally, under a ruler who would take this hidden wealth and, for one unforgettable moment, drag it kicking and screaming into the light of the entire medieval world. Musa Keita, I became Mansa, meaning king or emperor, of Mali around 1312, after the previous ruler, Abu Bakr II, disappeared. And I do mean disappeared. According to the account recorded by the Syrian historian al-Umari, Abu Bakr allegedly set out on an expedition with a massive fleet of ships to discover what lay beyond the Atlantic Ocean and simply never returned. According to the account, preserved by the medieval Syrian historian al-Umari, Abu Bakr became obsessed with exploring the limits of the Atlantic Ocean and equipped an expedition of many ships filled with men, gold, water and provisions before departing and never being heard from again. Whether that story is history or legend, Musa inherited the throne left behind, and he inherited an empire already extraordinarily wealthy. But it was one specific journey, taken over a decade into his reign, that would carve his name permanently into world history. In 1324, Mansa Musa set out on the Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca, obligatory for Muslims who are able to undertake it. Musa was devout, and he intended to make the journey properly, which, for the richest man in the medieval world, meant doing it on a scale nobody in Cairo, Medina, or Mecca had ever witnessed. The numbers, even when historians try to be conservative, are almost absurd. Musa reportedly traveled with a caravan that included tens of thousands of people, soldiers, officials, servants, and enslaved people, along with somewhere between 80 and 100 camels, each one loaded down with gold dust. Some accounts describe hundreds of camels. Estimates of the total gold he carried run into the tens of thousands of pounds. When his caravan passed through Cairo, Musa did something that, from a modern economic standpoint, is almost impossible to overstate. He began handing out gold, generously, repeatedly, to merchants, to the poor, to anyone who crossed his path in the city. He wasn't just spending, he was flooding the local economy with more raw gold than it had ever needed to absorb at once. And the market broke. Gold prices in Cairo and the surrounding region crashed almost overnight, because suddenly gold wasn't scarce anymore. It was everywhere. Merchants who had built their businesses around gold's rarity found their fortunes devalued in weeks. Some historical accounts suggest it took the Egyptian economy over a decade to fully recover from the inflation Musa's visit caused. A single man, on a religious pilgrimage, accidentally causing a multi-year recession in one of the wealthiest cities on earth, simply by being generous. There's a detail from this trip that almost never makes it into the shorter, simplified versions of this story. And it's the first real thread pulling us toward the hidden gold legend I promised at the start of this video. According to several historical accounts, by the time Musa's return journey passed back through Cairo, he had given away so much gold that he actually ran out. He had to borrow gold from Cairo's merchants at high interest just to make it home. The richest man in the medieval world went from causing an economic collapse through sheer overspending to needing a loan in the span of a single trip. Stop and think about what that actually tells us. If a man wealthy enough to crash an entire regional economy could still run out of liquid gold on a single journey, how much wealth was actually sitting back home in Mali, untouched, unspent, and unaccounted for? That question is exactly what historians and treasure researchers have been asking for centuries, and it's a big part of why the hidden gold legend refuses to die. We'll get to what that legend actually claims a little later. First, though, you need to see what all of this wealth built, because gold alone doesn't explain why Mansa Musa's empire mattered. What made Mali historically unforgettable wasn't just how much gold it had, it was what the empire did with it. If Cairo is where the world learned Mansa Musa's wealth, Timbuktu is where the world should have learned his legacy, and largely didn't, at least not to the degree it deserves. Timbuktu already existed before Musa's reign, founded as a seasonal settlement by Tuareg nomads around the 11th or 12th century, strategically positioned near the Niger River at the southern edge of the Sahara. Its location made it a natural meeting point between trans-Saharan trade routes and the river trade of West Africa, salt coming down from the north, gold coming up from the south, and eventually ideas flowing in from every direction in between. But it was during and after Mansa Musa's reign that Timbuktu transformed from a trading post into something extraordinary, one of the great intellectual capitals of the medieval world. On his return from the Hajj, Musa brought back scholars, architects, and religious leaders from Mecca and Cairo, most famously the Andalusian architect Abu Ishaq es-Saheli, who is widely credited with helping design some of Mali's most iconic structures, including the Jinguereba Mosque in Timbuktu, still standing today, built from mud brick in a style unlike anything else in the region at the time. But mosques were just the beginning. Timbuktu became home to an entire ecosystem of learning. The most famous of its institutions, Sankore Madrasa, functioned as something close to a university, with instructors, structured curricula, and a sprawling network of scholars who traveled from across the Islamic world specifically to study or teach there. Subjects covered astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, and Islamic theology, alongside poetry, history, and trade. Here's the number that tends to stop people in their tracks. By some estimates, Timbuktu was home to somewhere between 100,000 and 700,000 manuscripts at its intellectual peak, spread across libraries, mosques, and private family collections passed down through generations. To put that in perspective, at a time when many European universities were still operating with a few hundred hand-copied texts guarded like treasure, a city in West Africa was home to a private and institutional manuscript collection, potentially rivaling the largest libraries on the planet. These weren't just religious texts either. Manuscripts recovered and studied in modern times cover astronomical observations, mathematical formulas, medical treatises on treating diseases and performing surgeries, legal rulings, and even critiques of political leaders. Proof that Timbuktu's scholars weren't simply copying inherited knowledge, but actively producing new work. And this is where the story of Timbuktu quietly intersects with the hidden gold mystery again, because the wealth generated by Mali's gold trade is precisely what funded this intellectual explosion. Scholars in Timbuktu were often supported financially, allowed to dedicate their lives to study and writing instead of labor, specifically because the empire's gold wealth could sustain them. Gold didn't just buy luxury, it bought centuries of preserved human knowledge, which makes what happened next even more tragic. Because a huge percentage of those manuscripts, by some estimates, the majority, have never been properly catalogued, studied, or even located by modern historians. Some are known to still exist, hidden away in private family trunks across Mali and neighboring countries, protected for generations by families terrified of them being seized, sold, or destroyed. Others were reportedly buried, hidden in walls, or smuggled out of the city entirely during periods of instability and invasion in later centuries, deliberately concealed, the same way Mali's original gold mines were deliberately hidden from foreign eyes centuries earlier. Same instinct, same strategy. Hide what's valuable, and only the right people will ever find it again. So now we have two hidden treasures tangled together in the same empire. Gold that was allegedly buried and never fully recovered, and knowledge that was allegedly buried and never fully recovered either. Later in this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly what oral tradition and modern researchers believe happened to both, including a specific location that local legend has pointed to for generations, and why some historians think part of that legend might actually be true. But to understand why an empire this wealthy, this advanced, and this intellectually rich would need to start hiding its treasures in the first place, we need to talk about what came after Mansa Musa, because the story of Mali doesn't end at its peak, it ends in collapse. And the way it collapsed is exactly why so much of its wealth is still considered lost today. Empires rarely die from a single blow. They erode, and Mali's erosion, once it began, exposed exactly why so much of its wealth ended up hidden instead of simply inherited by the next generation. Mansa Musa died sometime around 1337, after a reign of roughly 25 years. He was succeeded first by his son, Magan I, and later by his brother, Suleiman, and for a while the empire held its shape. But holding an empire together across 400,000 square miles of West Africa, with dozens of vassal states, competing regional governors, and a succession system that wasn't always clearly defined, is enormously difficult even under the best leadership. Under weaker leadership, it becomes almost impossible. Over the following century, Mali began fragmenting. Vassal territories that had once paid tribute to the Mansa started asserting independence. The most consequential of these was the rise of the Songhai Empire, centered around the city of Gao, which had originally existed as a tributary state under Mali's control. By the mid-1400s, Songhai had grown powerful enough to break free entirely, and not long after, powerful enough to start conquering Mali's own territory, including, eventually, Timbuktu itself. This is a detail that surprises a lot of people. Timbuktu, the city most associated with Mansa Musa's legacy, actually spent more of its golden intellectual age under Songhai rule than under Mali's. It was during the Songhai Empire, particularly under rulers like Sunni Ali and later Askia Muhammad, that Timbuktu's scholarly institutions reached their absolute peak, with Sankore Madrasa expanding further and drawing scholars from across the Islamic world. But here's where the story turns darker, and where the hide-it-before-they-take-it instinct we talked about earlier becomes central to everything that follows. In 1591, an invading force from Morocco, armed with early firearms, a technology West African forces at the time largely lacked, crossed the Sahara and crushed the Songhai Empire at the Battle of Tondibi. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the Moroccan army's guns proved devastating against Songhai's traditional cavalry and infantry. Songhai's political structure collapsed almost immediately afterward, fracturing into competing successor states that never recovered the region's former unity or wealth. And Timbuktu, the crown jewel of this entire intellectual and economic system, fell under foreign occupation. This is the exact moment historians point to when they talk about deliberate concealment. As Moroccan forces occupied Timbuktu, scholars, wealthy merchant families, and religious leaders, the very people responsible for the city's manuscripts and remaining wealth, understood exactly what foreign occupation typically meant for a conquered city's treasures: seizure, looting, forced taxation, and the destruction or theft of anything valuable, especially religious or scholarly texts that a new regime might consider threatening or heretical. So they hid what they could. Numerous historical accounts and oral traditions describe manuscripts being sealed inside walls, buried in trunks beneath the floors of family homes, smuggled out of the city on camelback to smaller, less noticeable towns, or hidden in caves outside the city entirely. Entire family libraries, some containing manuscripts going back generations, simply vanished from any official record, not destroyed, but deliberately made invisible, with knowledge of their location passed down only within trusted family lines, often only to the eldest son, sometimes only verbally, never in writing at all, specifically so no invading force could ever torture the information out of a written record. This is genuinely one of the reasons modern historians believe so many Timbuktu manuscripts remain uncatalogued even today, in the 21st century. Families in Mali have, for literal centuries, treated their inherited manuscripts less like museum pieces and more like closely guarded family secrets, sometimes revealing collections to researchers only after building trust over years, sometimes never revealing them at all. And it wasn't just paper that disappeared this way. According to oral tradition preserved by griots and passed down through Malian communities for generations, a portion of the empire's gold wealth, separate from what was actively circulating in trade, was deliberately buried during periods of political instability using the exact same logic as the manuscript concealment. Hidden reserves, kept apart from the treasury a conquering force would obviously seize first, buried in locations known only to a small circle of trusted royal or religious officials, meant to be recovered only once stability returned. Except stability, in many cases, never fully returned. Officials died. Wars continued. Occupying forces changed hands multiple times over subsequent centuries. Moroccan control, followed eventually by Tuareg influence, followed by French colonial conquest in the late 1800s. Every disruption meant fewer people alive who actually knew where these reserves were. And oral tradition, however carefully preserved, is fragile. It only takes one generation failing to pass the knowledge down completely for a location to become myth instead of memory. Which brings us to the part of this story I promised you at the very beginning. Because this isn't just abstract historical theory. Local legend in the region has, for generations, pointed toward specific locations, specific enough that treasure researchers, historians, and yes, more than a few opportunistic gold hunters have spent real time and money investigating them. I'm going to walk you through exactly what those legends claim, what modern research has actually found, and why at least one of these locations has never been fully excavated. But before I do, you need to understand one more piece of this puzzle: what actually happened to Timbuktu's manuscripts in the modern era, because part of this story is far more recent than most people realize, and it involves a race against destruction that happened within many of our own lifetimes. Here's something that tends to genuinely shock people watching this. The fight to preserve Timbuktu's hidden knowledge didn't end in some distant century. It happened as recently as 2012 and 2013, well within the memory of most adults watching this video right now. By the early 2000s, historians and international preservation organizations had become increasingly aware that Timbuktu's manuscript collections, the ones that had survived centuries of hiding, war, colonization, and neglect, were in serious danger, not from invaders this time, but from decay. Manuscripts hidden for generations in trunks, wrapped in leather and cloth, stored in homes without climate control across a punishingly hot and dry climate, were physically deteriorating. Termites, humidity fluctuations, and simple old age were succeeding where centuries of conquest had failed. International efforts, backed by organizations including UNESCO and funded through partnerships with various governments and universities, began working to catalog, digitize, and properly preserve what survived, including the manuscripts held in Timbuktu's most famous modern institution, the Ahmed Baba Institute, named after a renowned 16th-century Timbuktu scholar and named specifically to honor the city's intellectual legacy. And then, in 2012, disaster arrived in a form nobody expected. Militant groups linked to extremist organizations seized control of northern Mali, including Timbuktu, during a period of political chaos following a military coup in the country's capital. These groups imposed a strict, extremist interpretation of religious law on the region, and as part of that campaign, they specifically targeted Timbuktu's historic sites, destroying multiple centuries-old mausoleums and shrines that they considered idolatrous, and threatening the city's manuscript collections directly, viewing much of the accumulated scholarly work as heretical or contrary to their interpretation of religious doctrine. This is where the story becomes almost unbelievable, because what happened next reads less like history and more like a heist thriller, except in reverse, with librarians as the heroes. As militant forces occupied the city, a coalition of Timbuktu residents, librarians, archivists, and ordinary citizens working with a man named Abdelkader Haidara, a librarian who had spent decades collecting and preserving manuscripts across the region, organized a covert operation to smuggle tens of thousands of manuscripts out of the city before they could be discovered and destroyed. Manuscripts were hidden in rice sacks, packed into car trunks, and transported at night along dangerous routes out of occupied territory toward the capital, Bamako, where they could be kept safe. This wasn't a government-funded, high-security operation. It was largely funded and coordinated by local citizens and international preservation partners working with limited resources under real physical danger, smuggling irreplaceable centuries-old texts past armed militants who could have executed anyone caught helping. By most accounts, this smuggling operation successfully preserved the overwhelming majority of Timbuktu's most significant surviving manuscript collections. Estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of documents were saved through this effort. It stands as one of the most remarkable and criminally underreported cultural preservation efforts of the 21st century. Think about what this actually means for the story we've been telling. The same instinct that drove families to hide manuscripts from Moroccan invaders in 1591, protect the knowledge, move it in secret, trust only a small circle of people, was the exact same instinct used to save that same knowledge from a completely different threat over 400 years later. The pattern of hiding Timbuktu's treasures didn't end with the medieval period. It has repeated itself again and again, all the way into recent memory. And it raises an important question that we still haven't answered. If manuscripts hidden centuries ago were successfully protected through generational secrecy and are still being discovered in private family collections today, what does that suggest about the gold? This is where we finally get to the legend I've been promising you. Because according to accounts passed down through oral tradition in the region, accounts that some historians take seriously enough to have actually investigated, there are at least 2 specific locations connected to Mansa Musa's empire where local tradition insists undiscovered gold reserves remain buried, untouched, since the era of the empire's decline. I'm going to tell you exactly what those legends claim, and exactly what's actually been found so far, right after this. Let's talk about what local oral tradition actually claims, because this is the part of the story that rarely gets told accurately. Most popular retellings either wildly exaggerate it into a full-blown treasure hunt fantasy or dismiss it entirely as baseless folklore. The truth, as usual, sits somewhere more interesting in between. According to oral histories preserved by griot lineages in the Mali region, the same hereditary oral historians responsible for preserving the epic of Sundiata Keita for hundreds of years before it was ever written down, there are recurring references to royal gold reserves that were separated from the empire's actively circulating treasury during periods of political threat. Unlike the gold used for trade, tribute, or the enormous public displays Mansa Musa became famous for in Cairo, These reserves were, according to tradition, deliberately kept out of any official accounting, not hoarded out of greed, but preserved as a kind of insurance, wealth meant to fund the empire's survival, rebuilding, or ransom in the event of catastrophic invasion. Griot tradition and regional folklore point to a few recurring locations tied to this story. One is the area surrounding ancient goldfields near Bure, one of the two major gold-producing regions that originally built Mali's wealth in the first place, along the upper reaches of the Niger and Senegal river basins. Local tradition holds that as instability increased in later centuries, portions of gold extracted from these fields were never sent to the capital at all, deliberately left buried near the mining sites themselves, hidden by local overseers loyal to the crown rather than transported along routes that invading forces could intercept. Another location tied to this legend is closer to Timbuktu itself, and specifically connects to the 1591 Moroccan invasion we discussed earlier. Oral tradition describes wealthy families and religious officials in the city burying both manuscripts and gold together in the same hurried effort, in locations known only to a small number of trusted individuals. The idea being that if the gold was ever recovered, the manuscripts buried alongside it would be recovered too, and vice versa. It's a detail that, if true, would mean some of Timbuktu's undiscovered intellectual treasures and undiscovered gold reserves might not just be separate mysteries, they might be sitting in the exact same hole in the ground. Now, here's where I have to be honest with you, because a responsible deep dive doesn't get to just repeat treasure hunter fantasies as fact. No verified, large-scale royal gold cache from the Mali Empire has ever been definitively excavated and confirmed by professional archaeologists. This isn't a story with a satisfying "and then they found it" ending. Not yet, anyway. But that doesn't mean nothing has been found. It means what has been found strongly supports the idea that these traditions aren't just folklore invented for entertainment. Small, scattered gold artifacts and hoards, consistent with the wealth of the Mali Empire period, have been discovered across the region over the decades. Sometimes by archaeologists conducting formal excavations, sometimes accidentally, by farmers or construction workers digging in areas with no prior indication of historical significance. These discoveries are typically far smaller than the legendary hidden royal reserve, but they matter for a different reason. They confirm that the practice of burying wealth during periods of instability wasn't just something griots described in stories. It was something people in the region actually did, repeatedly, across multiple centuries, in multiple locations. The legend isn't inventing a behavior out of nothing. It's describing a documented historical pattern and simply extending it to its largest, most tantalizing possible conclusion. Archaeologists working in West Africa have also pointed out something else worth mentioning here. Large portions of the territory once covered by the Mali Empire have never been thoroughly excavated using modern archaeological methods. Political instability in the region over recent decades, limited funding for large-scale digs, and the sheer size of the former empire's territory all mean that West African archaeology, compared to, say, Egyptian or Mesopotamian archaeology, which has been intensively studied for well over a century, is still in a comparatively early stage. Sites that could hold major discoveries may simply not have been searched yet, using the kind of ground-penetrating radar and systematic survey techniques that have uncovered hidden tombs and treasures elsewhere in the world. Which means the honest answer to, is Mansa Musa's hidden gold real, isn't a satisfying yes or no. It's this: the tradition is old, consistent, and geographically specific enough that serious historians take it seriously as a possibility, even while no one has definitively proven it, and the territory involved is large enough and under-excavated enough that the possibility hasn't been ruled out either. There's one more thread to this story, though, And it might be the most quietly remarkable part of the entire legacy, because it's not about gold that might still be buried. It's about a specific piece of evidence that already surfaced centuries after Musa's reign, in a place nobody was looking for it. In 1375, roughly 4 decades after Mansa Musa's death, a Jewish cartographer named Abraham Cresques, working on the island of Majorca off the coast of Spain, created what's now known as the Catalan Atlas, one of the most important surviving maps from the medieval period, and one of the earliest European maps to depict sub-Saharan Africa with any real geographic detail. And there, drawn directly onto the map, sitting on a throne in the region corresponding to West Africa, is a crowned black king, holding a golden orb in one hand and a golden scepter in the other. The accompanying text, translated from Catalan, describes this king as the lord of the black people of Guinea, so abundant is the gold found in his land. This figure is almost universally identified by historians as Mansa Musa. Sit with what this actually means for a second. 4 decades after his death, in a completely different part of the world, on an island off the coast of Spain, mapmakers who almost certainly never set foot in West Africa themselves were still using Mansa Musa's wealth, a wealth so overwhelming that it had rearranged Mediterranean gold markets for years, as literally the defining geographic landmark for an entire region of the African continent. Not a city, not a river, not a mountain range. A single man's reputation for wealth became the label an entire continent's worth of West African trade was known by in Europe for generations after his death. This is, in a very real sense, physical proof of exactly how far Mansa Musa's legend traveled, carried not by conquest, not by colonization, but by the simple, undeniable fact of how much gold he was known to control. The Catalan Atlas didn't need a treasure map to prove Mali's wealth was real. It just needed one image of a king holding gold, and that was considered explanation enough for why anyone should care about this part of the world at all. And this raises the exact question this video has been circling around from the very beginning. If Musa's wealth was so enormous that it reshaped how Europe mapped Africa, and if his empire deliberately hid the very sources of that wealth from outsiders for centuries, and if we already know, through documented, confirmed historical events, that Timbuktu's people hid treasures during invasions not once, but repeatedly, across multiple different centuries, right up through 2012. How confident can we really be that we've found everything? The uncomfortable, honest answer from historians who study this seriously: we can't be. Not remotely. What survives in museums, in the Ahmed Baba Institute, in private family collections that have chosen to go public, all of that represents, at best, a partial picture. The gold that funded Musa's generosity in Cairo came from mines that were successfully hidden from foreign eyes for the entire span of the empire's power. The manuscripts that survive today only exist because families broke centuries of secrecy to reveal them. For every collection that's been shared, how many families are still protecting collections nobody outside their household has ever seen? That's not a rhetorical flourish to end this section dramatically. It's a real, open historical question. And it's exactly the question the second video in this series is going to dig into much further, including the specific region where modern researchers believe undiscovered gold caches are most likely to still exist, and a specific family archive that was only partially revealed to historians as recently as the last decade. But before we get there, there's one more piece of Mansa Musa's legacy we need to cover, because his story isn't just about what was hidden, it's about how a black African emperor became, for a brief moment, the single most famous individual on the entire planet, known across 3 continents, centuries before modern communication existed, and how that fame and the trade routes it opened permanently altered world history in ways that go far beyond gold. It's worth pausing here to really absorb something that gets lost in most retellings of this story. For a brief window in the 14th century, Mansa Musa wasn't just the richest man in his region, or even in Africa. By several historical measures, he was arguably the most famous individual on the entire planet, recognized across West Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, at a time when most of the world's regions had almost no direct communication with one another at all. That's an almost impossible thing to achieve in the medieval period. Fame in the 1300s didn't spread through newspapers, printed books, or word-of-mouth networks that crossed oceans easily. It spread slowly, through trade caravans, through pilgrims, through the handful of scholars and merchants who physically traveled between civilizations. For a name to become known across 3 continents required something extraordinary enough to be worth repeating, city after city, caravan after caravan, for years. Musa's pilgrimage did exactly that. Merchants who witnessed his caravan in Cairo told other merchants. Those merchants carried the story back to Venice, to Genoa, to the trading ports of southern Europe. Scholars in the Islamic world, including the historian Al-Umari, who traveled to Cairo not long after Musa's visit and interviewed people who had directly witnessed the pilgrimage, wrote detailed accounts, specifically because the story was considered remarkable enough to document for future readers. By the time the Catalan Atlas was created in 1375, Musa's reputation had become so established in Europe that mapmakers who had never been anywhere near West Africa considered him the single most important detail worth including for that entire region of the map. Here's the part that deserves more attention than it usually gets, though, because Musa's fame wasn't just about personal wealth. It fundamentally reshaped trade. Once European and Middle Eastern merchants understood the sheer scale of gold available through trans-Saharan trade routes, interest in accessing that wealth intensified dramatically. Trade route activity across the Sahara increased. Cities along those routes, including Timbuktu, Gao, and Jenne, saw increased commercial traffic as merchants sought more direct access to Mali's resources. Some historians argue that Musa's pilgrimage indirectly contributed to European interest in exploring alternative routes to access West African gold and goods more directly. Interest that over the following century would help motivate Portuguese exploration down the West African coastline, eventually contributing to the broader European age of exploration. Let that sink in for a moment. A single religious pilgrimage taken by one devout ruler seeking to fulfill a personal religious obligation, ended up being significant enough that some historians trace threads connecting it to the broader European motivation to explore the African coast by sea. Decades before Columbus, decades before the transatlantic voyages that would go on to reshape the modern world. Musa wasn't trying to start any of that. He was trying to complete the Hajj properly, as an act of faith. The economic and historical aftershocks were simply a byproduct of how much wealth traveled with him. And this is where the story of Mansa Musa becomes genuinely bittersweet, because despite all of this, despite reshaping regional economies, despite becoming a defining reference point on European maps, despite funding one of the greatest intellectual centers in the medieval world, Mansa Musa's name faded from mainstream global memory far more than his historical impact would suggest it should have. Ask the average person on the street today to name the richest person in history, and you'll get answers like Rockefeller, Carnegie, or contemporary billionaires. Very few people will say Mansa Musa, despite the fact that multiple modern historical and economic analyses have concluded that, when his wealth is measured against the economies he could influence and the resources he controlled, no verified historical or contemporary fortune clearly surpasses his. Some estimates have described his fortune as almost incalculable in modern dollar terms, precisely because gold-based medieval wealth doesn't translate cleanly into modern currency valuations. But even the most conservative comparisons place him at the very top of any legitimate ranking of history's wealthiest individuals. Why did he fade from popular memory while his wealth remained historically unmatched? Historians point to a combination of factors: the Eurocentric focus of much of the historical record that got preserved, translated, and taught in Western education systems for centuries afterward. The fact that Mali's own written records, kept largely in Arabic script and passed down through scholarly and religious institutions rather than centralized state archives, were far more vulnerable to the very concealment, war, and colonial disruption we've spent this entire video discussing. And frankly, the fact that so much of what Musa actually built, Timbuktu's manuscripts, the hidden gold reserves, the true scale of Mali's economic infrastructure, was never fully catalogued or publicized in the way European royal treasuries and achievements historically were. In other words, the same instinct towards secrecy and concealment that protected Mali's wealth from foreign invaders for centuries may have also, unintentionally, buried Mansa Musa's rightful place in global historical memory. That's a strange, almost poetic irony to sit with. The empire's greatest strength, its ability to hide what mattered most from those who would exploit it, might be exactly why so few people today understand just how significant Mansa Musa truly was. So what's actually left of all this? In the present day, Timbuktu still exists as a city in modern Mali, though it's a far smaller and, in recent decades, far more troubled place than its medieval golden age would suggest. Ongoing political instability, conflict involving extremist groups, and broader regional insecurity in Mali over the past decade have made it one of the more dangerous and difficult places in the world for researchers, tourists, and even local residents to safely access historical sites. Several of the city's centuries-old mausoleums, destroyed during the 2012 occupation, have since been painstakingly rebuilt with support from UNESCO and international preservation partners, using traditional building techniques and, in some cases, original materials salvaged from the rubble. The Jingwareba Mosque, originally constructed during Mansa Musa's reign with the guidance of the architect Abu Ishaq es-Saheli, still stands in Timbuktu today, continuously rebuilt and maintained using traditional mud brick restoration techniques for nearly 700 years, a living architectural link directly back to the empire's golden age. The manuscripts smuggled out of Timbuktu during the 2012 crisis remain primarily housed in Bamako, Mali's capital, where digitization and preservation efforts have continued with support from international university partnerships and cultural heritage organizations. Digital copies of many manuscripts are now available for scholarly research, meaning that, for the first time in the document's long and secretive history, some of Timbuktu's intellectual treasures are more accessible to global researchers than at almost any point since they were originally written. But, and this is worth repeating clearly, because it's the honest, unresolved core of this entire story, a substantial number of Timbuktu's manuscripts remain in private family hands across Mali and neighboring countries, uncatalogued, undigitized, and largely unknown to the outside world. Every year, researchers working in the region report discovering previously unknown family collections, some containing documents that add meaningfully to historians' understanding of West African history, science, and law during the medieval and early modern periods. And the gold, the legendary buried reserves tied to Mansa Musa's empire, referenced in oral tradition for generations, remains, as of today, unconfirmed, not disproven, not discovered, simply unresolved, sitting in that frustrating, fascinating space between documented historical pattern and unverified legend, which is exactly where this story leaves us, and exactly why it isn't finished. Here's what we've covered in this video: an empire that built one of history's greatest fortunes on gold it deliberately hid from the outside world, a ruler whose single pilgrimage was generous enough to crash a regional economy and famous enough to define an entire continent on European maps for centuries afterward. A city, Timbuktu, that became one of the medieval world's great intellectual capitals, funded entirely by that same hidden wealth, and whose manuscripts were hidden, rediscovered, hidden again, and smuggled to safety through a genuinely underreported rescue effort as recently as 2012. And running underneath all of it, the same unresolved thread, a legend consistent across centuries of oral tradition, describing gold reserves buried during the empire's periods of greatest danger, gold that, according to that tradition, was never recovered because the people who buried it either died, fled, or simply lost the ability to pass the knowledge down before it was too late. We know families in Mali are still, today, protecting manuscript collections nobody outside their household has ever seen. We know small gold artifacts, consistent with the empire's wealth, have surfaced across the region for decades, confirming the practice of burial during instability was real. We know large portions of the former empire's territory have never been properly surveyed using modern archaeological technology. What we don't know, yet, is where the largest of these legendary reserves might actually be. But the legend doesn't point nowhere. It points somewhere quite specific, toward a region that a small number of dedicated historians and researchers have spent years quietly investigating, using a combination of oral history interviews with descendants of griot families, colonial-era survey records that were only recently rediscovered in French archives, and preliminary geological surveys that have identified unusual, unexplained soil disturbances in areas with no obvious modern explanation. That investigation, the specific location, the specific family archive that may hold the final clue, and the reason some historians believe we may be closer to a real discovery than at any point in the last century, is exactly what the next video in this series is going to cover in full detail. If you've made it this far, you already understand why this story deserves more attention than it's ever gotten. Mansa Musa wasn't just wealthy. He was, quite possibly, the single most underappreciated figure in world history. A man whose empire's secrets have survived 7 centuries of war, colonization, and neglect, specifically because they were designed to survive exactly that. Some of those secrets have already come to light, through the courage of families who chose to share what they'd protected for generations, and through preservationists who risked their lives smuggling irreplaceable manuscripts out of a war zone under armed occupation. But some secrets are still out there, still buried, still waiting. Part 2 is where we go looking for them. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it, because trust me, what we found while researching that next location changes the way this entire story ends.